Welcome to our next episode. Last episode, we were talking about PowerShell and demonstrating some different ways that we could use it to begin to automate some tasks, for example, pulling some information out of our Active Directory. In this week's podcast, we're going to continue on and we're going to try to modularize some of the code that we wrote last week, also simplify, clean it up, and finally, generalize it just a bit to create something that we can use in many different tasks that we'll be conducting over the next couple of weeks. Now, before you came, I actually did do a little bit of housekeeping, and there are one or two things that I've done ahead of time. The first one is I took some of the code that we were working with last week, the code that actually got the handle for doing a domain search, and I've moved that into what's called a function. Now we're actually going to create a function this week and see how we can leverage these sorts of things. But I just want you to see that this code is actually exactly the same code that we wrote last week. The only difference is it's in a function, and then the very last thing that the function does, notice it just has this line right here. Well, let's read through this function really quickly and see what's happening. If you want more detail, I'd recommend that you go back and take a look at AuditCast number 24. Well, the very first thing, just like last time, we begin by figuring out which domain we're currently in, and then create a new object, a new System Directory Services Directory Searcher object, and configure it for that domain. So here's we are getting that object. Next we begin the configuration, setting the search scope to be subtree, and I've included some comments here that indicate what the other type of searches are that are available. And then finally, we set it up to work within this domain. All right, so that's easy, but what's this last line do? Well, you've got two ways that you can return a value from a function within PowerShell. The first one is you could use the keyword return, followed by the variable or whatever the variable value is, or if you simply put that value by itself on the last line, that is what will be returned. So that's the first file that I've created. In my function here, though, that I'm going to create, I need a way to actually access that information. I need to be able to pull that in. And that's where this second little piece of code is, or comes in, that I have setting here. So let me just make a copy of this code, because I'm not actually going to import it. Instead, I'm just going to use it right within my script and explain what it does. So I'll paste that in here. So this function, all it's going to do is figure out what the correct path is for this script right here that I'm about to write. What does that mean? Well, for instance, let me just save this to start with, and I'm going to give it a name, and I'll call it let's see here, let's call it get 80 objects. That's what I'm going to call it. And we'll explain why that is and what this function does in just a minute. But with that saved now, it's stored, you may have seen, let me go back into Save As, it's actually being stored in C:users administrator.enclave forensics desktop PowerShell get 80 objects. So that is the fully distinguished path. Well, within PowerShell, when you want to reference a piece of code or run a piece of code, you may recall that you need to give it the direct path to the file. You cannot rely on the file simply existing within your path. So how do we get around that? Well, since I'd like to import that other script, here's what I'm able to do then. What I can do is simply say, I'll set a variable named import equal to join path, which is a built-in commandlet. It's going to allow me to create a path essentially. I'm going to tell it to join the path of whatever the current script directory is. Now you'll see there that that's the name of the function that I have just above this. That function figures out what the actual path is for the current running script. And I'm going to add that to the file that I'd like to grab. The file I'd like to grab is the get directory service searcher.ps1. There it is. The only last thing I need to do is to actually import that file, and the way you do that is the simple dot, all by itself. Actually, you do need something with it. The dot says you're going to import something. You need to now tell it what it is. Now you could put an entire path here, C::users. You could do that. But the better way is to do it programmatically using that variable so that now it doesn't matter what directory these things are in. As long as the supporting files are in the same directory as the script you're running, this will work just fine. In fact, I can even save this as it is right now and run it. Now there's no output because we haven't had it create any output yet, but it is now successfully importing that other function. Let's describe what it is that we're trying to do in this particular episode. What we'd like to do is leverage the existing code we have to go and do a search in the Active Directory, but we'd like to go a step further and actually create a little piece of abstract code that will let us go and search for arbitrary objects, pull them back, and return them in a way that they can be used. This is actually going to be very useful code as we move forward because it's going to create or begin creating for us a little bit of a library that we can just leverage for all of the different tasks. For instance, if we wanted to find all of the users whose accounts permit them to have no password, well, we need to figure out the LDAP query for that, but the code to actually go and get those objects and show them to us would not change at all. Or if I wanted to go and find all of the groups, again, I would need to write the right query for that, but this code would not need to change at all. So this general kind of code becomes extremely useful moving forward. Now let's see how we do it. I'm going to begin by creating a function, and I'm going to name the function the same as the name of this file. Now, for what we're doing here, that's not actually required, but since I'm going to use this as a piece of abstract code that I'll load from other places, it only makes sense to name it with that same name so that when I import that file, I actually know just from the name what the name of the function is that I need to call. Now this function is going to take a single argument, in other words, I can send it a value, and that is going to be LDAP filter. Now right now, the way this is written, if the user doesn't send us a value, if they don't actually create a filter, the filter is going to be null. There will be no filter. And that probably isn't what we'd like. So I'm going to set a default value for this. The way you do it is quite easy. It's similar to what you do in some other languages as well. You simply take that variable within the definition and you say it's going to equal, and now you just give it a default value. So I'm going to give it a default LDAP query filter, and I know that we haven't spent some time talking about these in any detail yet, but we will be doing that in just an episode or two. But for now, I'll just give it some easy ones. I'm going to say that it's going to search for objects that are of category person and of object class user. So in other words, it's going to find all of the objects that are both person category and class of user. Now that's the default. If we wanted to change that to look for groups, let's say, we could simply send in or pass in the LDAP filter of our choosing. But we're going to rely on the default for today. All right, with that done, let's now see what we can do in order to get information from the Active Directory. You'll remember the majority of last week was spent actually building the code to do that. But now that we've abstracted it into a function, watch how easy it is to use. I'm simply going to create a variable called domain searcher, and I'm going to say that it's going to be equal to get directory service searcher. Now what does that function do? Well, I know from the name what it does, but I don't even need to look at the code because right up here, you see, we've imported that in already. So I don't need to clutter up this file with all of that information. I can simply rely on it. Once I've got that searcher, I just need to set a few configurations. For instance, let's say domain searcher dot filter equal to whatever the current filter is. Now that would be either the default, or if they've sent me one, whatever they've sent. And then we need to, well, for this episode, I think I'm going to set a limit on that. Now, using this within a domain, if I were doing testing or development, I would probably use a limit here. Or if I were trying to do sampling, I could use that here as well. But just for the purposes of this episode, I don't need all of the thousands of users out of the domain. Just 10 is going to be fine to show that the code is working. Lastly, I actually need to get the results. So the query is built, I just need to actually go and execute it. So I'll say domain searcher, find all. Now already you've probably noticed that this code looks much more compact and much cleaner because we've abstracted all of that effort that was put into building the directory services searcher object. So this makes our life much, much better. In fact, we can even show that this code works just as it is. I'll just add $results here as the last line so that it's going to return that value. Then I'll save this file, and I'm going to click the play button. Now let's see, I do seem to have an error here. I'm getting a missing parentheses, so let's just see if we can straighten this out. It's on line 11, it's saying. Let's just see, line 11. Oh, let's see, yes. Notice that I created this function here, right? I've got this opening paren here, but I didn't actually put the closing parenthesis at the... Sorry about that. Put that final closing paren in there, save the file, and let's execute it again. No problem, it runs very cleanly. Now there's no output, but that's because all we've done is define functions. To get the output, we just need to call that function. For instance, I'm going to say my result equals get 80 objects. Wow, it didn't get an error, but what did it do? Let's take a look at my results. Well, I don't see anything here. Let me call get 80 objects directly. And there it is. I actually do have some results there. It is returning something, but what are those things that are coming back? How can I use them? When I pull that into my results is going to be coming back as a type of object that's going to contain, you can see here, a path with lots and lots of properties. In fact, I can process that information. I could do this. I could say get 80 objects, and I'm going to send that output through out grid view. Now the grid view is a really handy way to put information out in a PowerShell script because it's going to create a graphical interface for you to let you see what you've actually created. You can of course search and sort and all those great things. And what you can see here is it creates things with two columns here. It creates what the actual LDEP path is for where the item is, and a whole list of properties. Well, this is something, but to now get access to each of those pieces, I would need to individually pull them apart and identify what the names of all the features are and all those other things. We want something that's going to be much more generic than that. So I'm going to do a little bit of PowerShell scripting here that's just slightly more advanced, and just follow along and take a look at what the results are. What I'll do now is I'm going to start by creating, I'm going to say 80 objects. I'm going to create my own class of object. Now this is a very interesting thing because normally within PowerShell you just rely on the .NET classes that are returned to you. But sometimes those classes are very hard to work with in the condition that they show up. For instance, in this case, having to now pull apart all the properties. So we'll approach it a little bit differently. This line right here, all it does is create an empty array. Now I'll go with a for each statement and tell it to take each result that shows up in the results that I've now produced in my Active Directory query, and I'm going to do something with those. I'm going to first create a new object. Now the object I'm going to create does not have any predefined class. It's just going to be a generic object, really an empty object. To do it, you simply say new object, system.object. So I now have this completely blank object. And then I'm going to do another for each. Remember that each of those rows that we had in our result had a couple of columns in it. It had the path and it had the properties. The properties are what I'm really interested in. I want to take those all apart. So I'm going to say that for each property in the result properties property name, I want it to do something with those. What I'd like it to do is create an object or populate that object, add a new object or members to that object. Now the format for this is a little odd. It feels like it should be something like this. Maybe this object.add member. That feels like the way it ought to be done, but it's actually done through the pipeline. So I'm going to pass this object into a commandlet called add member. What do I want to add? I'd like to add a member of type note property. The name of that is going to be whatever the current property name is, because it's looping through all of them. And the value is going to be whatever the property value. Now that should look familiar, because last week we actually used the property item notation to extract values out of the query we created. So we're leveraging that here. I now need to give it the name of the property I'd like. There it is. All that does is adds that property to this object that I've created, this one that has no class to it, and created a named property with the name of the current property, holding the value of that property. Next, AD objects plus equals this object. I simply add that object to my array, and that's it. Now, that code may seem a little strange, and it does require a little bit of working with it and kind of taking it apart to figure out what's happening here. But there's a really big thing that happens now when I return this. So let me just save that. I'm just changing the name to match the AD objects array that I've created. I'll save that, and I'm going to execute it again. So once it's been executed, I can now rely on its results. And this time, I do have some errors there, so we're going to have to go back and create those. Let's see, can I call on a null-valued expression? What have I got going on here? All right, so I've tried to call this member on... Have I misspelled something? Let's just go back and have a quick look. All right, and I think I see the problem. I'm looking down here at the error, which is a little bit tricky to understand. And my first inclination would be to think the problem is with this object. But if I look more closely, it's actually telling me at the end, here's your issue. It has to do with $property, and it's saying that that's a null-valued expression. Well, how could that be? It turns out that the problem is really up on this line here. It's property names that we're trying to look through, because it's an array of names. And with that fixed, let's just make sure we don't have any other error here. And let's see. There is one other. We'd also like to convert this because we're still looking at the properties there. And save that. Let's run it one more time. And let's execute it this way. And much better. And notice now that we have a view of all of the individual properties for that user or each of the users that has been extracted. Now, that's actually as far as we're going to take it for today. We're going to leverage what we've done today in next week's script, though I do want to point out just one or two limitations with what we've created so far. The primary limitation has to do with the grid view. The grid view is quite useful, but the grid view is only going to be able to show you up to 30 columns. And it turns out that the user objects that we're looking at have far more columns than that. There is another small issue. Actually, let me pull that back up. I don't know if... yes, here it is. The user account control field is actually an encoded value, a bit encoded value, that helps you to identify what different properties are set for that user. And we're going to have to spend a little bit of time seeing how to take that apart and turn it into something useful. So we'll spend some time with that next week as well. And then finally, let's see here. If you look at the account expires date, you'll see that some of them are set to zeros and others are set to this very large number. So the dates that are being returned to us are not going to be in the normal date format that you're used to for most of them, but instead are going to need to be interpreted. And even then, for instance, take a look at these. It happened in 1601. Did it really happen then? Well, that's what that is indicating, is that it has never happened, but there's actually an offset that we need to add to our dates in order to make them look correct, because January 1st, 1601 is actually the beginning of the timestamps for the Windows operating system. That's actually what a 0 is going to represent for us. So we'll need a way to interpret that as well. For now, though, that's going to be the end of this particular episode. As usual, we will post all of the show notes and the source code to these on the sans blog, and if you have any questions and have any ideas for things that you'd like to see done using Active Directory and PowerShell, please feel free to send me a note, and we'll be sure to get those things done as soon as possible. Please tune again next week as we explore this a little bit more and start seeing how to turn this into something we'd use in a useful audit process.